My name is Nora, and I am exactly 34 years old. For 27 years, my parents raised my brother as a golden prince while I was locked away as a ghost. I washed his clothes, scrubbed his floors, and lived entirely in his shadow. They looked me in the eye and told me some children are simply born to serve. But on the day of his lavish Napa Valley engagement party, my brother's new father-in-law took a close look at my face. He noticed a rare detail hidden in my eyes, prompting one single phone call. The DNA results that followed did not just expose a 30-year-old lie. They completely destroyed a fraudulent empire. Before I share my story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to break free from toxic people. The Napa Valley estate was a sprawling monument to extreme wealth. Rolling vineyards stretched into the distance, providing a rhythmic backdrop to the gentle melodies of a live string quartet playing near the outdoor tasting terrace. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceilings of massive white event tents, and floral arrangements worth hundreds of thousands of dollars scented the evening breeze with the fragrance of white roses. I was not there to celebrate. I was forced to wear a scratchy, ill-fitting gray catering uniform. From the cheap synthetic fabric clinging uncomfortably to my skin in the sweltering heat, I navigated the shimmering sea of elite guests, with my head bowed, desperately trying to remain as invisible as my family had always demanded I be. My older brother Julian was the groom-to-be, and today was his ultimate coronation. He stood near the main mahogany bar, looking every inch the billionaire biotech chief executive officer he claimed to be. He wore a custom-tailored suit that cost more than I had been allowed to spend on food in a decade, laughing loudly with venture capitalists and medical industry titans. Beside him stood his fiancée, Maya. She was a brilliant, independent woman of color who looked absolutely stunning in a custom designer evening gown that swept across the manicured lawn. Maya possessed a strong moral compass, a razor-sharp mind, and an elegance that made her the center of attention. She came from a proud, accomplished family, completely unaware of the dark rot hiding beneath her new partner's charming exterior. I held a heavy silver tray loaded with delicate crystal glasses of vintage red wine. My arms ached from hours of serving. My feet blistered inside cheap black shoes, but I knew better than to stop. My mother, Evelyn, demanded absolute perfection from her staff, and she considered me the lowest-ranking member of it. Evelyn wore a sapphire blue gown dripping in heavy diamond jewelry, playing the role of the ultimate society matriarch with terrifying precision. She moved through the crowd collecting compliments and offering fake, tight-lipped smiles to everyone she deemed important. As I walked past the main head table, carefully balancing the teetering tray of wine, Evelyn deliberately stepped directly into my path. I tried to pivot, shifting my weight quickly to avoid a collision, but her eyes locked onto mine with a familiar, malicious gleam. She shifted her designer heel and deliberately hooked it right around my ankle. The world seemed to move in agonizing slow motion. I lost my balance, entirely pitching forward as my arms flailed uselessly. The heavy silver tray slipped from my desperate grasp. Dozens of crystal glasses shattered against the marble terrace with a deafening, violent crash. A massive wave of sticky, expensive red wine splashed across the polished stone, stopping just inches away from the pristine, delicate hem of Maya's custom dress. The string quartet abruptly halted their playing. The entire reception fell dead silent. Hundreds of wealthy, influential eyes turned to stare at me as I lay sprawled on the wet, dangerous floor, my uniform soaked and my knees badly scraped by broken glass. Evelyn looked down at me from her towering height, her face contorted with pure, unadulterated disgust. She did not offer a helping hand. She did not even ask if I was hurt. "Look at what you have done," Evelyn sneered, her voice carrying sharply across the silent courtyard, echoing loudly enough for every single guest to hear. "Some children are just born to serve, and clearly you cannot even manage that correctly. Pick up the broken glass, you worthless dropout." I looked up at my older brother, hoping against all historical evidence for just a tiny fraction of human decency. Julian simply took a slow sip from his own wine glass and smirked. He turned to a group of his wealthy investor friends, shaking his head and chuckling softly, offering zero defense for his own sister. He reveled in my public humiliation, completely comfortable letting me take the full blame for our mother's calculated cruelty. The tension in the air was immediate, heavy, and suffocating. The guests stared, whispering behind manicured hands, judging the clumsy, pathetic servant who had nearly ruined the perfect society party. I kept my eyes fixed on the floor, fighting the burning tears of rage and shame, knowing that any reaction would only fuel their twisted narrative. I was trapped in a nightmare they had designed specifically to break my spirit and keep me in my place. But as I carefully picked up the jagged shards of crystal with my bare, bleeding hands, a cold wave of absolute clarity washed over me. I was not the helpless victim they believed me to be. I was quietly observing, constantly calculating, and silently surviving. Every cruel word Evelyn spat, every arrogant smirk Julian offered only fueled the silent fire burning inside my chest. They thought they had successfully crushed me into total submission, blinding themselves to the reality that a cornered mind sharpens itself into a lethal weapon. The whispers of the high society crowd washed over me, cementing my role as the ultimate family failure in their eyes. But inside my own head, I was already visualizing the complex digital architecture of Julian's entire fraudulent company. I already knew every password, every hidden back door, every dirty financial secret they desperately tried to bury. They demanded I serve them, completely unaware that I was just biding my time until I could dismantle their entire world. As a drop of my own blood mixed with the spilled wine on the marble floor, I made a silent vow. This would finally be the very last day I ever bowed my head to them. My father Arthur marched over to join the spectacle, his leather shoes crunched over the broken crystal. He grabbed my upper arm, digging his fingers into my skin, and jerked me upward with a force that nearly dislocated my shoulder. "Do not mind her, everyone," Arthur announced to the silent crowd, forcing an apologetic smile toward his friends and the board members of Julian's company. "My daughter has always been unstable. She is terribly jealous of Julian's success and constantly tries to ruin his moments. It is a tragedy, really, but we do the best we can with her condition. Please continue enjoying the evening." I bit the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted blood. I knelt back down on the damp marble and began gathering the jagged shards of crystal with my bare hands, ignoring the cuts forming on my palms. I let them call me a jealous dropout. I let the wealthy guests look at me with pity. They murmured among themselves, buying into the perfectly constructed lie. Arthur and Evelyn had spent decades perfecting this narrative. To the outside world, they were the saintly parents of a deeply disturbed child. To them, I was the dark stain on their pristine facade, a problem to be hidden away when company came over. They used my forced silence as proof of my supposed illness, weaponizing my quiet obedience to justify their extreme control. If I cried, I was hysterical. If I argued, I was having an episode. So I learned early on to turn my face to stone. I risked a glance toward the head table. Julian was already turning his back to the scene, wrapping his arm around his new fiancée, Maya. He leaned down and whispered something in her ear, shaking his head with a practiced look of sibling exhaustion. He was the golden child, the undeniable center of the universe Arthur and Evelyn had built. While Julian was sent off to elite boarding schools, handed the keys to luxury cars, and groomed for corporate greatness, I was pulled out of high school under the false guise of behavioral issues. My parents convinced the world I was unfit for society, effectively banishing me to the windowless basement of our home. I became the unpaid servant for my own family. I spent my youth scrubbing Julian's bedroom, cooking his meals, laundering his designer clothes, and watching life pass me by from the shadows. He had a private tutor for biochemistry, while I had a mop and a bucket of bleach. He never once questioned why his sister wore threadbare clothes while he wore custom-tailored suits. He simply accepted my absolute servitude as his natural birthright. Maya looked over Julian's shoulder at me. Her dark eyes were filled with genuine confusion and a flicker of concern. She took a step forward, perhaps intending to ask if I needed bandages for my bleeding hands. But Arthur quickly intercepted her. He placed a heavy paternal hand on her bare shoulder, shaking his head sadly, murmuring low words of warning about my unpredictable nature. Maya stopped, visibly torn between her basic human decency and the stern warnings of her new father-in-law. Julian smoothly pulled her attention back to the celebration, snapping his fingers at another server to bring a fresh tray of drinks. The absolute apathy from my brother was a physical blow. He did not hate me. Hate requires passion. He felt nothing for me at all. To him, I was merely a broken appliance, a defective household tool that occasionally caused an embarrassing mess. I swept the broken glass onto a silver dustpan, the sharp edges biting deeper into my skin. The physical pain was grounding. Let them believe the lie I told myself repeatedly. I remained completely silent, biting my tongue until it throbbed with a dull ache. Any emotional reaction, a single tear running down my cheek, a raised voice defending my innocence, a trembling lip showing my fear would instantly be weaponized against me. Arthur would point to my tears and declare me unhinged to the crowd. Evelyn would use my righteous anger to justify locking me back in the basement for weeks on end. So I gave them absolutely nothing. I became a hollow shell, a blank canvas onto which they could project their malicious lies, but behind my blank, dead eyes, my mind was racing with terrifying precision. I thought about the thousands of solitary hours I had spent in that dark basement, illuminated only by the harsh blue light of dual computer monitors. I thought about the complex cybersecurity frameworks I had constructed from scratch while they slept in their luxury beds upstairs. They truly believed they had isolated me from the world, but they had actually given me uninterrupted, unmonitored time to conquer the digital one. Every cruel remark, Evelyn spat every forced chore, Arthur demanded every stolen opportunity. Julian paraded in front of me had simply added volatile fuel to an engine they could not possibly see. They demanded I serve them, completely unaware that I was just biding my time until I could dismantle their entire fraudulent world. I stood up slowly, the heavy dustpan shaking slightly in my bleeding hands. The string quartet cautiously resumed, playing a lively classical piece, desperately attempting to wash away the heavy awkwardness of the moment. The guests quickly turned back to their expensive conversations, eager to pretend the ugly scene had never happened. Evelyn shot me one final venomous glare, a silent command to disappear into the kitchen and never show my face again. Arthur adjusted his silk tie and laughed loudly at a joke made by an important venture capitalist. Julian kissed Maya's cheek, completely erasing my existence from his mind. I turned and walked toward the catering tent. My posture was perfectly subservient, my gaze lowered appropriately to the floor. I played the role of the broken, unstable dropout flawlessly. But as I passed the large floral arches framing the exit, I felt a heavy, deliberate gaze fixed upon me. It was not the mocking stare of an elite guest or the cruel glare of my parents. It was something entirely different, something sharp, analyzing, and profoundly dangerous to the lies my family had constructed. Victor, Maya's father, stepped deliberately out of the crowd and into my path. He moved with the quiet grace of a man who had spent his life hunting monsters in the dark. He was a retired Interpol director, a man whose career was built on exposing the ugly truths wealthy people paid millions to bury. He did not look at me with uncomfortable pity or treat me like a common stain. Instead, he reached into his suit pocket, withdrew a pristine white silk handkerchief, and extended it toward my hands. I hesitated, my instinct screaming at me to keep my head down and walk away. Interaction with guests was strictly forbidden by Evelyn, punishable by days locked in the basement. But Victor did not move. He stood like an immovable mountain, offering the cloth with a silent demand that I could not ignore. I slowly raised my head to decline his offer. For the first time all evening, I looked a guest squarely in the eye. Victor locked his gaze onto mine, and in that split second, the world around us seemed to grind to a complete halt. I watched the composed mask of the retired investigator crack. He froze. The breath hitched in his chest, and his broad shoulders went rigidly stiff. He was not looking at the cuts on my hands or the cheap wine-soaked fabric of my uniform. He was staring directly into my eyes with an intensity that made my pulse pound in my ears. I possessed an extremely rare genetic mutation affecting my melanin production. My irises were a striking golden amber, but radiating outward from the pupil was a vivid, unmistakable starburst pattern of pure black. It was a striking anomaly, one that Evelyn had always forced me to hide behind thick glasses or by keeping my gaze firmly planted on the floor. She called it a freakish defect, but to the trained mind of a seasoned international investigator, it was an undeniable biological fingerprint. I saw rapid calculations firing behind his dark eyes. 30 years ago, long before becoming a celebrated security consultant, he was a hungry young agent assigned to one of the most high-profile unsolved mysteries in the world, the Sterling family yacht tragedy. A billionaire couple perished in a devastating explosion aboard their heavily fortified vessel. Their immense fortune was left in limbo because their 4-year-old daughter, the sole surviving heir to a massive global empire, vanished into the smoke without a single trace. The only other people missing that night were 2 newly hired undocumented deckhands. That little girl was famous for one highly specific physical trait: a rare black starburst ring circling a golden amber pupil, the exact same genetic marker staring back at him right now. Victor stared at me, and I stared back. The silence between us heavy with unspoken questions. He was not looking at a broken, unstable maid. He was looking at a ghost who had just walked out of a cold case file. I saw his eyes dart briefly across the courtyard, landing on Arthur and Evelyn, who were busy entertaining the medical investors. He analyzed their faces, comparing them to 30-year-old suspect sketches locked deep in his memory. The resemblance of the missing deckhands to my supposed parents hit him like a physical blow. The pieces of a massive, sinister puzzle were slamming together in his mind. Just as Evelyn noticed us and began marching toward the archway with fury, Victor instantly masked his profound shock. Drawing on decades of undercover training, he completely shifted his demeanor. The intense investigator vanished, replaced by the jovial father of the bride-to-be. He let out a booming laugh that echoed loudly enough to stop Evelyn in her tracks. "What a night this has been," Victor announced, his voice dripping with forced warmth. "We absolutely must capture the behind-the-scenes moments of this beautiful party. Everyone is being so serious today. Let us get a quick picture for the memory book before you run off to clean up." Before I could protest, and before Evelyn could reach us to physically drag me away, Victor stepped right beside me. He raised his heavy smartphone, turning the high-resolution lens directly toward my face. He did not bother framing the beautiful floral arches or the sunset. He angled the camera and zoomed in precisely on my face, specifically targeting the unique pigmentation of my eyes. The harsh white flash went off, blinding me momentarily and capturing the irrefutable evidence he needed. "Thank you so much, my dear," Victor said smoothly. He lowered the phone, his jovial smile never wavering, though his eyes remained dangerously sharp. Evelyn finally reached us, her chest heaving with barely contained rage. She grabbed my arm violently, her fingernails biting into my bruised skin. "I apologize for her intrusion," Evelyn said, her voice dripping with venom masked as politeness. "She is supposed to be in the kitchen. I will handle her immediately." Victor simply smiled, giving a polite nod. "Think nothing of it, Evelyn. It is a stressful day for everyone. I need to step away and make a quick call to congratulate a relative who could not make it." He turned his back and walked away from the crowd toward a secluded corner of the vineyard gardens. I watched him go as Evelyn dragged me toward the catering tent, shoving me through the swinging doors. Through the small glass window, I kept my eyes fixed on Victor's retreating figure. He reached the edge of the property, far from listening ears. He tapped a secure application on his phone and dialed a private number. He raised the phone to his ear, his posture rigid with urgency. He spoke quietly to a trusted former contact. "I need you to pull the Sterling missing child file from 30 years ago," he whispered, his voice tight with unresolved investigative tension. "I need facial recognition and genetic markers prioritized immediately. I think I just found her." The opulent engagement party dragged on for hours, wrapping up past midnight. I remained trapped in the heat of the catering tent, washing hundreds of crystal glasses and scrubbing industrial pans until my fingers bled. Exhaustion settled deep into my bones, but my mind raced with the memory of Victor staring at my eyes. I knew something catastrophic was coming. I could feel it in the tense whispers between Arthur and Evelyn every time they passed the swinging doors. They were panicking. My public failure had drawn far too much attention to the ghosts they kept locked in the basement. The heavy kitchen doors violently swung open. Arthur and Evelyn marched toward me, their faces twisted with a calculated rage. Before I could even drop the dish towel, Arthur grabbed me by the collar of my cheap uniform. He did not say a single word. He simply dragged me out the back exit, forcing me down the stone steps toward the dimly lit service driveway. The humid night air hit my face as I stumbled over the sharp gravel. Evelyn followed closely, clutching a velvet jewelry box tightly in her hands. Standing by a line of luxury black vehicles were Julian and Maya waiting to depart for their hotel. Julian looked incredibly annoyed by the delay, while Maya appeared exhausted. That vanished, the absolute second Evelyn shoved me hard toward the pavement. "Look at her," Evelyn screamed, her voice breaking with a masterful, highly theatrical sob. I caught her sneaking out of the master suite. She was trying to pawn off her own future sister-in-law's diamonds. Evelyn flipped open the velvet box, revealing a stunning antique diamond necklace that Maya had taken off earlier in the evening. I stared at the sparkling stones, completely bewildered. I had not left the catering kitchen in 6 straight hours. I had never even seen the inside of the master suite. But before I could speak a word in my own defense, Arthur kicked my shin hard, forcing me to my knees on the gravel. "We gave her a safe home," Arthur boomed, addressing Julian and a visibly shocked Maya. "We fed her. We tried to fix her broken mind. And this is exactly how she repays our generosity, by stealing from our own family on your engagement night." Julian scoffed, shaking his head with an exaggerated sigh of profound disappointment. "I told you she was a massive liability," Julian said, wrapping his arm protectively around Maya. "We should have locked her away in a facility years ago. She is a total parasite." Maya looked down at me, her sharp eyes rapidly scanning my bleeding hands, my bruised knees, and my soaked, dirty uniform. She looked at the diamond necklace in Evelyn's hands, then back to my face. I could see the rapid gears turning in her brilliant mind, instantly recognizing that a supposedly greedy thief was currently kneeling on the gravel, looking far more like a battered prisoner than a mastermind criminal. But she was newly engaged, surrounded by her partner's family, and unsure of the toxic dynamic unfolding in front of her. She remained completely silent, though her brow furrowed with deep, undeniable suspicion. "You are dead to us," Evelyn hissed, stepping close enough for me to smell the stale wine on her breath. "You will never set foot in our house again. You are banished permanently. Go rot in the gutter where you belong." She reached into her designer clutch, pulled out a single crumpled $50 bill and threw it directly at my face. The green paper fluttered down, landing in the dirt beside my bleeding knees. "Get your garbage car off this property before I call the police and have you arrested for grand larceny," Arthur commanded. He turned his back on me, aggressively ushering Julian and Maya into their waiting vehicle. The heavy doors slammed shut, sealing my fate. I watched the red taillights disappear down the long, winding driveway, leaving me entirely alone in the darkness. I picked up the crumpled bill. It was the absolute sum of my worth to them after 27 years of forced labor. I slowly stood up, my joints aching, and limped toward the service parking area. Hidden behind the catering trucks was my car, a rusted, beat-up sedan that barely passed inspection. It was the only possession I was allowed to keep strictly for running their tedious daily errands. I unlocked the creaking door and slid into the freezing driver's seat. My hands shook violently as I gripped the steering wheel, but I turned the key and drove out the massive iron gates of the estate, leaving my prison behind forever. I drove for miles without a destination, putting as much distance as possible between myself and the estate. I eventually found a desolate, unlit parking lot behind an abandoned diner. The night temperature plummeted rapidly, biting fiercely through the thin fabric of my uniform. I climbed into the back seat, pulling my bruised knees tightly to my chest to conserve body heat. The wind howled loudly against the cracked windows, turning the old car into a freezing metal box. I was entirely alone, stripped of shelter, completely broke, and branded a criminal by the only people I had ever known. Any normal person would have wept hysterically. Any normal person would have surrendered immediately to the crushing weight of total abandonment. But I did not shed a single tear. I laid my head against the cold vinyl seat and let my mind run through the cold, hard logic of the situation. Arthur and Evelyn had panicked. The wine incident had placed me directly under the spotlight right in front of international law enforcement. They were absolutely terrified that their dark, hidden secret was about to be exposed by a retired director who asked too many questions. Framing me for theft was merely a desperate, sloppy excuse to cut ties and dispose of the evidence before anyone started digging into their past. They thought throwing me into the freezing night would completely break me. They thought taking away my basement cell would leave me totally helpless. They had absolutely no idea that by kicking me out of their physical prison, they had just handed a master hacker the digital keys to the entire world. I closed my eyes, visualizing the command terminal on my hidden server. The cold night was just the beginning of my reckoning. A sharp, sudden knock against the frosted glass of my driver's side window violently shattered the silence of the car. My eyes flew open, my heart instantly hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. My immediate terrifying thought was that Arthur had followed me. I fully expected to look up and see my father flanked by bribed local police officers ready to drag me away on fabricated theft charges. My hands instinctively curled into tight fists, bracing for a physical confrontation. But as my eyes adjusted to the gloomy darkness of the parking lot, I realized the towering, imposing silhouette standing in the freezing wind did not belong to Arthur. It was Victor. He wore a heavy wool overcoat tailored perfectly to his broad frame, his posture completely unaffected by the biting cold. He did not look angry, nor did he offer a warm, comforting smile. His face was an absolute mask of professional stoicism, carved from years of handling worst-case scenarios. He raised one large gloved hand and tapped the glass a second time, gesturing firmly for me to lower the window. My fingers trembled as I turned the ignition halfway, supplying just enough power to lower the window an inch. A blast of freezing air rushed into the cabin, but Victor did not flinch. He did not offer empty platitudes or ask how I was holding up after being brutally cast out by my family. He treated me with the serious, unsentimental respect of an equal stepping into a war zone. "Take this," Victor commanded, his deep voice slicing cleanly through the howling wind. He slid a thick, heavy manila folder through the narrow crack in the window. The file landed heavily on my lap. The edges of the folder were worn, and a stark red diagonal stamp across the front read heavily redacted in bold block letters. Before I could ask a single question, Victor leaned down, placing his face mere inches from the glass, his dark eyes locked onto mine, with that same intense, calculating scrutiny he had displayed at the engagement party. "Read it carefully, Nora," he instructed, his tone leaving absolutely no room for argument. "Do not look for the family you thought you knew. Look at the facts right in front of you. I am parked 3 spaces behind you. Turn your dome light on and read the file. We do not have much time." He stepped back and disappeared into the shadows, leaving me alone with the thick envelope. I reached up and clicked on the dim yellow dome light of my rusted car. My hands were still bleeding sluggishly from the shattered wine glasses, leaving small red smudges on the heavy cardstock. As I flipped the folder open, the sharp, distinctive smell of old paper and stale ink filled the small cabin. The top document was a digitized scan of an international incident report dated nearly 30 years ago. The bold, stark header read "Sterling Family Yacht Explosion and Missing Persons Investigation." I forced my analytical mind to take over, reading the document with the same cold, detached precision I used to hunt for vulnerabilities in corporate firewalls. The report detailed a catastrophic, highly suspicious blast that completely leveled a legendary luxury vessel. The primary victims were Richard and Eleanor Sterling, a young billionaire couple whose massive fortunes spanned global pharmaceutical sectors and emerging biotechnology. According to the forensic investigators, the explosion was absolute sabotage. Explosives had been placed strategically near the engine room, intentionally trapping the couple inside the lower decks. Their bodies were recovered from the wreckage, and their multi-million-dollar global empire was plunged into total legal chaos. But the tragedy did not end with the explosion. I turned the page, and the air completely vanished from my lungs. The next document was a missing child alert issued by international authorities. The text detailed the absolute disappearance of the couple's sole surviving heir, a 4-year-old girl. She had vanished from the yacht on the exact night of the blast, entirely unaccounted for in the debris. Beneath the bold, desperate text was a digitized photograph of the missing child. I stared at the grainy image, feeling a wave of severe vertigo crash over me. The little girl had dark hair and a serious, quiet expression, but it was the detailed medical description printed directly beneath the photograph that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. Subject possesses a highly distinct, extremely rare genetic melanin mutation, the report stated with clinical detachment. Irises present as golden amber, heavily bordered by a vivid, unmistakable starburst pattern of pure black around both pupils. My breathing grew shallow and erratic. I slowly raised my eyes to the rearview mirror, tilting it downward to catch the dim yellow light of the car dome. Staring back at me were the exact same golden amber eyes, undeniably featuring a bright, jagged starburst of black. The realization struck me with the force of a physical blow. The incredibly rare trait Evelyn had always called a freakish defect and forced me to hide behind thick a defect at all. It was a multi-million-dollar biological fingerprint. My hands shook violently as I forced myself to turn to the final section of the thick file. The pages were labeled primary suspects. The report detailed that the 4-year-old heir was not the only person missing from the yacht that night. The Sterlings had recently hired a young couple to act as live-in deckhands for the massive vessel. They too vanished into thin air. The very night the explosion occurred, leaving behind no forwarding address, no financial footprint, and no logical explanation. Attached to the suspect file were 2 black and white employment photographs. I stared at the grainy, highly contrasted images. The man in the photograph had a sharp, arrogant jawline and cold, calculating eyes. The woman beside him possessed a high patrician forehead and a tight, inherently malicious smile. Even with the terrible image quality, even stripped of the designer clothes, expensive haircuts, and 30 years of aging, the bone structure was absolutely undeniable. It was a young Arthur and a young Evelyn. The entire framework of my reality shattered in a single, devastating instant. I was not an unwanted, unstable daughter born to be a servant. I was not an ugly dropout who was a burden to a wealthy family. I was a kidnapped child. They had not taken me in out of obligation. They had stolen me, kept me hidden in a windowless basement, and convinced the world I was mentally unfit purely to control my existence. Every cruel punishment, every forced isolation, every terrifying lie they fed me was a calculated strategy to keep a stolen billionaire heir entirely subdued. I closed the file, my heart hammering a dangerous, steady rhythm against my ribs. I looked at the rear-view mirror one last time. The scared, submissive maid was entirely gone. The heir to the Sterling Empire stared back, her golden eyes burning with absolute lethal clarity. I grabbed my battered laptop bag, the only item I salvaged before Arthur shoved me out. I walked through the freezing wind toward Victor's vehicle. He stood by the door watching me approach. He did not ask if I had read the file or how I felt. He simply unlocked the passenger door and gestured for me. I climbed into the heated leather seat, gripping my laptop bag tightly against my chest. Victor got behind the wheel and put the car in gear. We drove away from the desolate parking lot, leaving my old life behind in the darkness. The drive was completely silent. I watched the streetlights pass by, letting the brutal truth settle into my bones. The realization that my entire existence was a calculated lie could have broken a weaker person, but the years of isolation in that basement had forged my mind into something cold and incredibly resilient. I was not a discarded maid, weeping over cruel parents. I was a kidnapped heir, and the people who stole my life were currently sleeping soundly in a mansion funded by my stolen legacy. "We need absolute proof now," Victor said, his deep voice breaking the silence as he steered the heavy vehicle onto the highway. "A visual match and a 30-year-old file will not hold up in federal court or freeze their assets. I have a trusted contact at a private genomics facility. It operates 24 hours a day for high-profile clients who require absolute discretion. We are going to get your DNA rushed." I nodded, appreciating his tactical approach. He operated exactly the way my mind worked, prioritizing actionable evidence over emotional comfort. 20 minutes later, we pulled up to a sleek, unmarked glass building in a quiet industrial park. Victor bypassed the front desk entirely, leading me through a side door using a secure key card. A waiting technician dressed in pristine medical scrubs greeted Victor with a silent nod. He led us into a sterile, brightly lit examination room. The process was incredibly fast. The technician swabbed the inside of my cheek, sealed the sample in a tamper-proof file, and promised Victor the expedited results would be sent to his encrypted server within a few hours. Victor and I moved to a private minimalist waiting area down the hall. He paced near the frosted glass windows, speaking softly in a language I recognized as French, into his secure phone, likely coordinating with his former Interpol contacts. I sat down on a stiff leather sofa. The initial shock of the night was entirely gone, replaced by a razor-sharp burning focus. Sitting quietly and waiting for a laboratory to confirm my identity felt entirely too passive. I refused to be the helpless victim waiting for rescue. I had the skills to start the war right now. I unzipped my bag and pulled out my laptop. I powered it on and connected to my customized, heavily encrypted mobile hotspot. The screen bathed my face in a pale blue glow, a comforting and familiar sensation that instantly centered my thoughts. I opened my hidden command terminal. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a fraction of a second before I began typing with blinding speed. Over the past decade, whenever Arthur threw a broken hard drive at me, or Julian aggressively demanded I fix his crashed servers, they thought they were utilizing free disposable labor. They never realized they were handing a master lockpick the blueprints to their entire digital vault. Every time I repaired a device, updated a network, or configured a new smartphone for my golden child brother, I quietly embedded invisible backdoors into the system architecture. I created ghost administrative accounts that did not appear on any registry. I wrote silent protocols that granted me absolute unrestricted access to every single piece of digital hardware the family owned. Now sitting in the quiet clinical waiting room, I unleashed the full force of my hidden arsenal. I targeted the primary servers of Julian's highly publicized biotech startup. His company had just been valued at over $1 billion, supposedly guarded by top-tier outsourced cybersecurity firms. I initiated a massive untraceable hack, deploying a customized payload that slipped completely undetected through his expensive firewalls. The security protocols did not even register a breach because my access codes were recognized as the ultimate system creator. I bypassed his complex two-factor authentication instantly, primarily because I was the one who had secretly written the core algorithm generating his security tokens. Within 90 seconds, I was inside the most heavily restricted confidential layers of his corporate network. I bypassed the marketing databases, the employee records, and the public-facing project files. I drove straight into the heart of his empire, targeting the private financial servers, the clinical trial data, and the secure executive ledgers. I needed the money trail. I needed to see exactly how a mediocre student with absolutely zero scientific ability managed to secure massive seed funding to launch a global biotechnology firm. My computer screen filled with cascading lines of complex data routing automatically through a dozen offshore proxy servers. To completely mask my physical location, I initiated a mass download pulling gigabytes of restricted banking information, private emails, and confidential wire transfers onto my heavily encrypted local drive. I slowly opened the master financial ledger document. My eyes rapidly scanned the glowing columns of numbers and hidden account names. I traced the initial venture capital investments backward, unraveling the complex web of shell companies and blind trusts, designed to hide the true source of the funds. The money had not come from legitimate Silicon Valley investors. The massive capital had been funneled through a labyrinth of shady, untraceable entities. But I possessed the digital keys to unlock every single door. I kept digging, pushing deeper into the dark financial architecture of my brother's fraudulent success, preparing to uncover the devastating proof that would bring his stolen kingdom crashing down to the ground tonight. My fingers flew across the keyboard executing complex search algorithms I had written years ago, specifically for tracing laundered assets. I navigated the network architecture like a ghost walking through walls I had constructed myself. The heavy firewalls were completely useless against my master key. The digital paper trail was heavily obfuscated. Julian publicly claimed his initial seed capital came from a prestigious syndicate of private equity firms based in London and Dubai. I pulled up the glossy investor deck from the company website and cross-referenced it directly with the hidden internal ledgers. It was an absolute, undeniable fabrication. The venture capital firms listed on his corporate roster did not even exist. They were phantom entities, dummy corporations registered to empty postal boxes in international tax havens. I bypassed a secondary encryption wall, forcing the system to reveal the actual routing numbers attached to the incoming wire transfers. The money had traveled through a convoluted maze of offshore accounts, bouncing rapidly between dummy corporations to wash the digital fingerprints clean before finally landing in Julian's corporate treasury. It was a classic, highly sophisticated money laundering operation, but the perpetrators had severely underestimated the architect actively monitoring their network. I ran a reverse trace on the most prominent offshore account, meticulously stripping away the layers of fake corporate ownership. I peeled back the registrations, bypassing dummy names in Cyprus and holding companies in the Cayman Islands. My screen flashed rapidly as the final firewall collapsed, revealing the primary account holder. The name staring back at me was not a mysterious foreign investor or a wealthy medical mogul. It was Arthur. My pulse pounded in my ears as I expanded the search parameters, linking Arthur to dozens of other offshore holding companies. I pulled up the transaction history for the master account. The dates aligned perfectly with every major milestone in Julian's entirely fabricated career. When Julian needed $1 million to secure his luxury laboratory space, a wire transfer from Arthur cleared exactly 12 hours earlier. When Julian needed capital to fake his initial clinical trial metrics and impress the media, another massive deposit arrived from the exact same offshore entity. My supposed father was bankrolling the entire operation. But Arthur was merely a mid-level manager who constantly complained about household expenses. He did not possess the kind of personal wealth required to launch a billion-dollar biotech startup. I cross-referenced the origin of the funds flowing into Arthur's hidden accounts, aggressively searching for the ultimate source. The system decrypted the final layer of financial routing, exposing the original financial institution. It was a highly secure elite wealth management bank based in Zurich. I accessed the account details, and my breath caught sharply in my throat. The funds were not generated by brilliant business deals or lucky stock market investments. They were systematic scheduled disbursements drawn directly from a massive, highly restricted financial instrument. It was an irrevocable generational trust. I highlighted the name of the trust, reading the words twice to ensure my tired eyes were not deceiving me. The Sterling Family Generational Trust. The realization hit me with the devastating force of a freight train. Arthur and Evelyn had not just stolen me from a burning yacht 30 years ago. They had stolen my identity, my future, and my absolute birthright. The massive fortune currently funding my brother's luxurious lifestyle, his custom suits, his society engagement party, and his fraudulent company was actually my money. They had kept me locked in a damp basement, treating me like a worthless, unstable servant, while secretly siphoning millions upon millions of dollars from my murdered parents' estate to build an empire for their golden child. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal was staggering. Every cruel word Evelyn had ever spoken, every time Arthur had forced me to scrub their floors, they were fully aware that I legally owned the ground they walked on. I sat back on the stiff leather sofa, the pale glow of the laptop screen, reflecting the cold, hard truth of my existence. I had the digital proof. I had the bank routing numbers, the forged investor lists, and the undeniable evidence of massive financial fraud. I saved the entire data dump to my encrypted offline drive, securing the lethal weapon that would completely destroy them. Just as the secure transfer completed, the heavy silence of the private waiting room was broken by a sharp, sudden chime. I looked up. Victor was standing by the frosted glass window, holding his secure smartphone. The screen illuminated his focused, serious expression. He looked at the device, his eyes scanning the incoming message, then slowly raised his head to meet my gaze. The air in the small room felt incredibly thick, highly charged with the weight of a 30-year-old mystery reaching its absolute conclusion. Victor walked toward me, his heavy footsteps echoing loudly on the pristine tile floor. He did not speak immediately. He looked down at the encrypted email that had just arrived directly from the laboratory holding my biological sample. He took a deep breath, the chest of his tailored overcoat rising and falling with deliberate control. "We have the results," Victor announced, his deep voice carrying a profound, undeniable finality. He turned the phone screen toward me, allowing me to read the stark clinical text provided by the genomics lab. The genetic markers had been run against the international database, comparing my sample directly to the archived DNA profiles of Richard and Eleanor Sterling. The text on the screen was absolute. The probability of parentage was 99.9%. There was no margin for error. There was no room for Arthur and Evelyn to manipulate the truth ever again. The missing child poster that had haunted international files for 30 long years could finally be marked closed. "I am looking at the sole surviving heir to the Sterling dynasty," Victor stated, lowering the phone and holding my gaze with absolute unyielding respect. "You are not their servant, Nora. You are a billionaire." I closed my laptop with a definitive, satisfying snap. The scared, isolated girl they had abused for decades was officially dead. I had the biological proof of my stolen identity, and I possessed the digital evidence of their massive financial crimes. I stood up, feeling a dangerous, powerful calm settle entirely over my mind. They thought they had discarded a broken maid in a freezing parking lot. They did not know they had just unleashed a highly motivated heir, equipped with the exact tools needed to burn their entire fraudulent world to ashes. Victor secured a discreet rundown motel on the outskirts of the industrial district for us to regroup. He needed to coordinate with his global contacts to build a watertight case before making a formal move against Julian's fraudulent empire. I sat on the lumpy mattress of room 12, my laptop running heavy encryption algorithms to fully secure the massive data dump I had just pulled from the offshore servers. What I did not know was that my massive digital extraction had triggered a silent secondary failsafe deep within the network. Halfway across the state, Arthur's secure phone lit up with a critical, undeniable breach notification. He and Evelyn had spent 30 years fiercely protecting their stolen wealth, and they did not leave their digital vaults completely unguarded. When Arthur saw the origin of the breach, absolute panic immediately set in. He knew I was the only person on Earth with the technical capability to bypass those specific complex firewalls. But Arthur was a deeply paranoid, controlling man. Years ago, he had secretly installed a hardwired GPS tracker deep inside the chassis of my rusted sedan to monitor my every single movement. He considered me his personal property, and he never allowed his property to roam unmonitored. He pinged the tracker, instantly locating my exact coordinates at the cheap roadside motel. Realizing their entire false reality was minutes away from total annihilation, Arthur and Evelyn moved with desperate, ruthless speed. They did not call the police, knowing any official investigation would quickly expose their own crimes. Instead, they weaponized their massive wealth to orchestrate a far more sinister solution. Inside the dim motel room, the pale glow of my screen illuminated the undeniable proof of my stolen birthright. I was busy compiling the banking ledgers into a secure, automated dead man's switch. If anything happened to me, the documents would immediately broadcast to every major news outlet and federal financial regulator in the country. Victor had just stepped outside to his vehicle to retrieve a secure satellite phone, warning me to keep the heavy deadbolt locked. The silence of the early morning felt thick and heavy. I took a deep breath, finally allowing the reality of my true identity to wash over me. I was Nora Sterling. I was no longer a prisoner. I reached for my cold cup of coffee, feeling a profound sense of impending victory. Then the distinct, violent sound of heavy tires screeching against loose gravel shattered the quiet dawn. Before I could even stand up, the flimsy wooden door of the motel room buckled backward. The deadbolt snapped off the frame with a violent, terrifying crack. Arthur stormed into the room, his face flushed with a terrifying mix of panic and pure malice. Evelyn followed closely behind him, immediately launching into a highly theatrical sobbing performance. Behind them stood a tall, sharply dressed man, clutching a heavy black leather medical bag. I instantly slammed my laptop shut, instinctively throwing my body over the device to protect the encrypted data. Nora, my poor sick girl Evelyn, wailed, pressing her hands to her face in a perfect, entirely fabricated display of maternal agony. "We have been looking everywhere for you. We were so terrified you would hurt yourself in this terrible state." Arthur stepped forward, aggressively blocking my path to the broken door. "We told you she was having another severe episode," Arthur said, addressing the man with the medical bag. "She broke down at the party screaming about stolen jewelry, and now she has run off to this filthy place. She is completely out of her mind." I stared at them, my heart hammering furiously against my ribs. "You are not taking my laptop," I said, my voice dangerously calm, despite the adrenaline flooding my entire system. "I know exactly what you did. I know all about the offshore accounts, and I know about the Sterling Trust." Evelyn let out a loud, dramatic gasp, clutching the arm of the suited man. "You see?" Dr. Vance, Evelyn cried out, pointing a trembling finger directly at me. "She is entirely detached from reality. She has been having these extreme schizophrenic delusions for months. She truly believes she is some kidnapped billionaire, a severe psychotic break." Dr. Vance stepped forward, his eyes cold and entirely devoid of any genuine medical concern. He was clearly a corrupt physician on Arthur's massive payroll, brought here for one specific, highly illegal purpose. Arthur had utilized his immense stolen wealth to buy a professional who would gladly sign away my human rights without a single clinical assessment. Dr. Vance did not ask me a single medical question. He simply pulled a pre-filled legal document from his briefcase. "This behavior is incredibly dangerous," Arthur stated, taking a menacing step toward the bed. "She has been hacking into her brother's company, trying to destroy his business out of pure paranoid spite. We had no choice but to seek emergency medical intervention before she causes irreparable harm to herself or others." I realized with absolute horror what they were doing. They were not here to argue about the stolen money. They were executing a meticulously planned ambush to completely invalidate my massive discoveries. By legally declaring me insane, any evidence I brought forward about the Sterling fortune or their money laundering would be immediately dismissed as the ravings of a lunatic. Dr. Vance uncapped his expensive fountain pen and signed the bottom of the document with a swift, careless motion. "Based on the family's extensive testimony and the patient's clear state of severe paranoid delusion, I am authorizing an immediate, involuntary psychiatric hold," the corrupt doctor announced in a flat, monotone voice. "She requires aggressive, isolated residential treatment." He reached into his black leather bag and pulled out a heavy syringe, the needle glinting menacingly in the dim motel light. They were going to drug me, lock me away, and silence the true Sterling heir forever. I lunged forward, throwing my entire body weight across the mattress to reach my laptop. If I could just hit the enter key, the encrypted files would automatically broadcast to Victor and the international authorities, but Arthur was faster, fueled by the desperate, vicious energy of a man about to lose his stolen empire. He grabbed me by my hair, yanking me backward with brutal force. I kicked and thrashed my hands, clawing at his expensive suit, fighting with the raw instinct of a cornered animal. Evelyn shrieked, backing against the broken doorframe to stay out of the struggle. "Hold her down," Arthur roared, pinning my shoulders against the cheap motel carpet. Dr. Vance stepped forward, methodically, completely unfazed by my violent resistance. He uncapped the heavy syringe and drove the thick needle directly into the side of my neck. I felt a sharp, agonizing pinch, followed instantly by a freezing stream of liquid fire rushing through my veins. The effect was terrifyingly fast. Within seconds, my limbs turned to heavy, useless lead. My frantic kicks slowed to weak twitches. The edges of my vision blurred, collapsing into a dark, narrowing tunnel. I tried to scream for Victor to call out for the man parked just outside, but my jaw went completely slack. Only a quiet, pathetic gasp escaped my lips. Arthur reached over my paralyzing body and snatched my laptop from the bed, violently slamming the screen shut. The pale blue light vanished, plunging the room into absolute darkness. My heavy eyelids fluttered shut, and the last sensation I felt was Arthur grabbing my ankles, dragging my helpless, sedated body across the rough carpet and out into the freezing dawn. I floated in a dense chemical fog for what felt like an eternity. Fragmented memories pierced the heavy darkness. The aggressive rumble of a transport van, the harsh glare of passing streetlights, the terrifying sensation of being carried down long, echoing corridors by unfamiliar hands. When I finally forced my heavy eyes open, I was blinded by rows of humming fluorescent lights. A sharp chemical odor of bleach and clinical antiseptic assaulted my senses. I tried to sit up, but my muscles screamed in protest, weighed down by the powerful sedative. I was lying on a thin plastic mattress bolted directly to the center of the floor. I looked down and realized my clothes were entirely gone. The catering uniform was replaced by a stiff pale green hospital gown that scratched aggressively against my skin. Panic surged through my chest, hot and violent. I patted down the thin fabric, searching frantically for any connection to the outside world. My phone was gone. My heavily encrypted laptop was gone. My keys, my identification, and the manila folder containing my true genetic history had all been stripped away. The sterile room was a flawless, terrifying cage. There were absolutely no windows. The walls were painted a thick institutional white devoid of texture or color. A reinforced steel door with a small pane of shatterproof glass stood as the only exit. High in the corner of the ceiling, a black security camera hummed quietly, its red light blinking like a malicious eye tracking my every movement. They had stripped me of my digital weapons, cutting me off entirely from the power I wielded behind a keyboard. I was disconnected from Victor, isolated from authorities, and trapped in a fortified nightmare. I stumbled off the plastic mattress, my bare feet slapping against the freezing linoleum floor. I marched toward the heavy steel door and slammed my fists against the reinforced window. I pounded on the metal frame, putting my entire body weight into every strike. "Let me out!" I shouted, my voice cracking from the lingering effects of the drugs. "I am being held against my will. Call the police. I need to make a phone call." The heavy locks on the outside of the door clicked loudly. A burly male orderly stepped into the room, followed closely by a nurse holding a digital tablet. She did not look alarmed by my screaming. She looked profoundly bored. "Nora, you need to lower your voice and return to your bed," the nurse commanded, her tone dripping with patronizing authority. "You are experiencing a severe manic episode, and aggressive behavior will only result in further sedation." I stepped back, forcing myself to take a slow breath. "I am not Nora," I stated, gripping the edge of the mattress to steady my trembling hands. "My name is Sterling. I was kidnapped 30 years ago. My adoptive parents are running a money laundering operation using my stolen trust fund. You need to contact a retired Interpol director named Victor immediately." The nurse offered a condescending, tight-lipped smile and tapped her tablet. "Your parents warned us about this specific delusion," she said smoothly. "They explained that your condition makes you believe you are a missing billionaire heir. It is a classic, grandiose manifestation of your schizophrenia. They love you very much, Nora. They are paying a fortune to ensure you receive the absolute best psychiatric care available at this private off-grid rehabilitation center. We are here to keep you safe from your dangerous hallucinations." She turned and exited the room, the orderly stepping out backward before pulling the heavy steel door shut. The locks engaged with a heavy, definitive echo. I stood alone in the blinding white room. Claustrophobia crashed over me like a suffocating weight. The psychological pressure reached its absolute terrifying peak. I was trapped inside an institution specifically designed to strip away credibility. Every word I spoke would instantly be recorded as a symptom of my supposed madness. The sterile walls seemed to slowly close in mocking my capable mind. I was a master architect of the digital world, but locked inside this cage, I was completely powerless. I sank down onto the cold floor, burying my face in my trembling hands, as the devastating reality of my absolute isolation finally broke my composure. I did not have long to sit in that crushing despair. Barely an hour passed before the heavy deadbolts engaged again with a loud metallic clank. I scrambled backward, pressing my spine against the freezing concrete wall as the heavy steel door swung open. The burly orderly stepped inside, first securing the perimeter. Then Evelyn walked in. She looked entirely out of place in the sterile psychiatric cell. She wore a tailored crimson dress, her hair blown out to absolute perfection, a heavy antique diamond necklace glittering brightly on her chest. It was the very same necklace she had falsely accused me of stealing just 24 hours ago. She stopped in the center of the small room, looking down at my bare feet and the scratchy green hospital gown with a look of supreme satisfaction. She waved her manicured hand dismissively at the orderly. "Leave us," she commanded. He nodded and stepped out immediately, pulling the heavy door shut until the automated locks clicked securely into place. We were entirely alone. Evelyn did not bother maintaining the fake maternal agony she had performed so flawlessly at the motel. The weeping mother routine vanished, instantly replaced by the cold, calculating monster I had always known. She crossed her arms, her lips curving into a sharp, predatory smile. "You always were. A remarkably resilient little roach," Evelyn stated, her voice echoing coldly against the bare walls. "I will give you that much credit. You survived the damp basement. You survived our strict discipline. And apparently you survived long enough to snoop into financial matters that do not concern you." I glared up at her, refusing to let her see my mounting fear. "It concerns me because it is my life," I spat back. "I know exactly who you are, Evelyn. I read the international file. I know you and Arthur were the newly hired deckhands. I know you planted the explosives that killed my parents." Evelyn let out a harsh, barking laugh. "Do not give Arthur too much credit for that night. He was far too cowardly to wire the actual detonator. I handled the explosives myself. I placed them along the engine room bulkheads and watched the fire tear through the luxury yacht. It was a beautiful, necessary purge." She paced slowly across the linoleum, her designer heels clicking. "We did not want to take you. You were a whiny, demanding 4-year-old who cried incessantly. But you were the sole key to a massive financial empire. We needed you alive, at least until you served your ultimate purpose. So we dragged you onto a life raft, changed your name, and shoved you into the dark. We fed you scraps and forced you to fix Julian's computers because it kept you quiet and useful. You were never a beloved daughter. You were a long-term investment, a livestock asset we kept penned up until the market finally matured." Her words were meticulously designed to break my spirit, to reduce my entire human existence to a cruel financial transaction. But my analytical mind seized on the tactical information she was freely giving away. "You could have killed me years ago and tried to claim the money through legal loopholes," I reasoned aloud, watching her expression carefully. "But you kept me alive and hidden for 30 long years. Why go through all that trouble?" Evelyn stopped pacing and leaned down, bringing her perfectly made-up face mere inches from mine. "Because your biological father, Richard Sterling, was an insufferably paranoid man. He did not just lock his vast wealth behind standard banking protocols. He established an impenetrable time-locked trust, $300 million waiting in a heavily fortified account that we could not touch without triggering massive global alarms. We siphoned the loose capital from the offshore shell companies to build Julian's biotech company. Yes, but the primary vault, the real prize, has been sitting completely out of our reach for 3 decades. I stared at her, putting the final pieces together in my head. The trust has a maturation date. Evelyn's predatory smile widened, her eyes gleaming with unrestrained greed. Exactly. The Sterling Generational Trust unlocks on your 34th birthday. She paused intentionally, letting the terrifying reality settle over me. And your 34th birthday is exactly 3 days from now. The timeline hit me with staggering force. 3 days. 72 hours. That was the only reason they had orchestrated this elaborate, highly illegal psychiatric hold, instead of simply eliminating me. "You cannot access the funds without me," I stated, gripping the concrete floor to anchor my trembling body. the bank requires proof of life. They require the actual beneficiary. Evelyn stood back up, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from her crimson dress. Wealth management institutions holding hundreds of millions of dollars do not just ask for a signature on a piece of paper. They require absolute, undeniable biometric verification. They need a live retinal scan of those freakish golden eyes of yours. And they need a verified live thumbprint pressed directly onto their encrypted digital ledger. We have the terminal. We have the secured uplink already approved by the bank. We just need the physical keys. And since you have proven yourself to be uncooperative, we had to change our approach. Dr. Vance has authorized a strict, aggressive medication regimen. For the next 3 days, you will be heavily sedated, floating in a deep chemical coma that renders you entirely compliant. On the morning of your birthday, Arthur will walk into this room with the biometric terminal. You will be too drugged to fight, too weak to close your eyes, and too paralyzed to pull your hand away. We will press your thumb to the glass. We will scan your retinas. The $300 million will instantly transfer into our offshore accounts, and once the money clears, Dr. Vance will report that his severely schizophrenic patient suffered a tragic, completely fatal medical overdose in her isolated cell. Evelyn gave me one final triumphant look. "Enjoy your last 3 days, Nora." She turned and knocked on the heavy steel door. The orderly opened it immediately, and Evelyn stepped out into the bright hallway. The locks engaged with a heavy final echo, sealing me back into the freezing silence. I was left completely alone with the horrifying countdown ticking away in my mind. 3 days until they robbed my legacy. 3 days until they murdered me. I looked at the security camera blinking in the corner of the room, my panic rapidly morphing into cold, calculated rage. I had 72 hours to break out of an impenetrable fortress, and I was going to need a weapon. But I knew physical force was entirely useless against a heavily guarded private rehabilitation facility. My weapon had always been my mind, and to use it, I needed to play a highly calculated game. When the heavy steel door opened an hour later, Dr. Vance and the burly orderly entered with the first dose of their aggressive chemical cocktail. Instead of fighting, I immediately went limp. I let my shoulders sag and my eyes lose their focus. When Dr. Vance approached with a small paper cup holding 2 thick pills, I did not thrash or scream. I obediently opened my mouth. I placed the pills far back under my tongue, a trick I had learned years ago to survive Evelyn's forced sleep aids when she needed me quiet in the basement. I swallowed hard, gulping down the small cup of water, and opened my mouth to show the nurse it was empty. The moment they turned their backs to log the dosage on their tablets, I coughed the dissolving pills into the sleeve of my scratchy hospital gown. For the next 48 hours, I perfected the art of the chemically lobotomized patient. I dragged my feet when the orderlies moved me. I drooled slightly onto my collar. I stared blankly at the sterile white walls, completely unresponsive to verbal commands. The staff quickly grew bored with me. I was no longer a high-risk flight hazard. I was just another heavily medicated body taking up space. Because I appeared so completely subdued, they relaxed their protocols. On the morning of my 3rd day, the day before my 34th birthday, they decided I was docile enough to join the general population in the communal recreation room for supervised yard time. The recreation room was a depressing linoleum-tiled cavern filled with bolted-down plastic chairs and tables. The air smelled of stale coffee and heavy institutional cleaners. Several other patients shuffled aimlessly or sat staring at a muted television screen, bolted behind reinforced glass. I shuffled slowly toward a cluster of chairs near the back corner, my head hanging low, but my eyes were darting rapidly across the ceiling. I was mapping the surveillance grid. There were 4 rotating security cameras mounted in the corners of the room. I tracked their mechanical sweeping patterns, calculating the exact timing of their intersections. I noticed a structural flaw in the room's layout. A large load-bearing concrete pillar near the rear emergency exit created a narrow, triangular blind spot. If I sat perfectly still with my back pressed against the intersection of the pillar and the wall, the cameras would completely miss my hands. I needed hardware. I shuffled mindlessly toward a battered metal shelving unit filled with outdated magazines and broken medical monitoring equipment that the staff had lazily tossed aside. Tucked behind a stack of torn puzzles was exactly what I was searching for. A bulky, discarded digital blood pressure monitor and a broken electronic wall clock. They looked completely dead, likely abandoned by a previous nurse and ignored by the lazy staff. I casually draped my hospital gown over my arm, sweeping the broken devices off the shelf and hiding them securely against my ribs. But these basic tools were not enough to broadcast a digital signal on their own. I needed a frequency multiplier. I turned my hollow, vacant gaze toward the nurse's station positioned just outside the recreation room doors. A young nurse had left her rolling medical cart unattended for a fraction of a second, while she turned to unlock a medication cabinet. Resting on the top tray was an advanced digital thermometer. I dragged my bare feet across the linoleum, timing my approach perfectly with the rotation of the nearest camera. As the lens swept away, I bumped clumsily against the metal cart. In one fluid, practiced motion, I slipped the digital thermometer down the loose neckline of my gown. I mumbled a slurred, incoherent apology to the nurse as she turned around. She simply rolled her eyes in disgust and shooed me away. I retreated immediately to the narrow blind spot behind the concrete pillar. I sat cross-legged on the cold floor, pulling my knees up high to shield my workspace. I took a deep, steadying breath. My hands, which had been shaking with suppressed adrenaline for 2 days, became completely still. I was back in my element. I pried the plastic casing off the digital thermometer and the electronic clock using my fingernails. Inside the thermometer, I carefully extracted the tiny cylindrical quartz crystal oscillator. This tiny component regulated the timing of the display, but in my hands it was about to become the heartbeat of a clandestine transmission. Next, I cracked open the digital blood pressure monitor. The internal circuit board was dusty but structurally intact. Relying entirely on muscle memory and my deep understanding of hardware engineering, I began altering the current. I carefully detached the copper wiring, stripping the insulation with my teeth to expose the raw metal. I rerouted the copper wiring directly from the battery pack to the pressure sensor's data transmitter. I was effectively reversing the polarity of the entire circuit board by soldering the tiny quartz crystal from the thermometer directly into the monitor's primary oscillation circuit. I created a hardwired frequency multiplier. I used a paperclip I found wedged in the floorboards to bridge the final electrical connection. The modified circuit board hummed faintly. I had successfully transformed a piece of discarded junk into a rudimentary, highly focused shortwave jammer. It was completely unstable and would likely fry its own circuits within seconds of activation. But I did not need a prolonged broadcast. I only needed a microscopic window to push a single compressed data packet through the airwaves. The device was ready, but a transmitter was entirely useless without a digital bridge to the outside world. I closed my eyes, visualizing the administrative network of the private rehabilitation facility. I knew these off-grid institutions relied on standard satellite internet protocols to manage patient files and communicate with external healthcare providers. If I could boost my homemade transmitter signal just enough to intercept their wireless frequency, I could piggyback on their outbound data stream. I clutched the exposed circuit board tightly against my chest, waiting for the precise moment the guard shift changed. The countdown to my birthday was rapidly ticking away, and I was about to fire a digital flare directly into the international database. The digital wall clock above the recreation room doors flashed 3:15 in bright red numerals. The afternoon shift change was the single point of vulnerability in the facility's strict security protocol. I watched through the narrow gap between the concrete pillar and the wall. The 2 orderlies assigned to monitor the communal area turned their backs, walking toward the secure vestibule to brief their replacements. The heavy steel doors groaned open, creating a blind spot that would last exactly 45 seconds. I pushed myself off the cold linoleum floor. Moving with silent, calculated precision, I slipped out from behind the pillar, keeping my posture low. My target was the small, glass-walled observation booth adjacent to the recreation room. It was temporarily empty, the supervising nurse having stepped out before the new shift took over. The door was secured by an electronic magnetic card reader. I pressed my jury-rigged frequency jammer directly against the reader and flipped the battery switch. The exposed copper wiring sparked. The quartz crystal oscillator surged with misdirected electrical current. The crude device flooded the keypad with a concentrated burst of electromagnetic interference. The lock buzzed wildly, the green light flashing in frantic confusion before the magnetic seal gave way with a soft click. I shoved the door open and slipped inside the booth, pulling the door shut behind me. Resting on the center desk was an open administrative laptop. The screen was awake, displaying a basic, terribly outdated patient management portal. I dropped into the rolling chair and placed my hands on the keyboard. The familiar tactile sensation sent a rush of pure adrenaline straight to my brain. I pulled up the network settings and immediately found the facility's administrative wireless protocol and RACS administrative. It was shockingly vulnerable, protected by a rudimentary encryption standard that a novice could bypass in minutes. For someone with my architectural knowledge, it was like walking through an open gate. I bypassed the internal firewall using a rapid sequence of command line prompts, instantly elevating my access privileges from a standard user to a system administrator. The facility network lay completely bare before me. I quickly navigated to the central patient registry and searched for my assigned room number. The system pulled up a massive file. I opened the digital folder and rapidly scanned the contents. Dr. Vance had uploaded dozens of completely fabricated medical evaluations. The forged documents detailed severe schizophrenic episodes, violent tendencies, and extreme paranoid delusions regarding a stolen billionaire identity. It was a masterclass in medical gaslighting, meticulously designed to legally strip me of my human rights and grant Arthur absolute conservatorship over my assets. I did not panic. I highlighted the entire directory of forged medical records and prepared them for extraction. During the ambush at the diner parking lot before Arthur slammed my laptop shut, I had managed to push the massive cache of offshore banking ledgers to a dormant, heavily encrypted cloud server. I had shared the unique encryption key for that specific server with Victor. Now I just needed to link the two data points together. I opened a secure encrypted shell browser on the administrative laptop and tunneled my connection through 3 remote proxy servers to completely mask the facility's internet protocol address. I reached out across the digital void and successfully pinged my hidden cloud server. The connection held steady. I initiated a massive high-speed data dump. I routed the forged psychiatric evaluations directly into the secure Dropbox I shared with Victor. I simultaneously executed a command script that unlocked the offshore biotech financial ledgers, bundling them together with the facility documents. To ensure Victor knew exactly where Arthur was holding me hostage, I accessed the psychiatric hospital's internal geographic mapping protocol. I stripped the exact global positioning system coordinates of the building and embedded them directly into the header of the data packet. The progress bar on the screen flashed to life, calculating the volume of data being pushed through the satellite network. Through the glass walls of the observation booth, I saw the new shift of orderlies enter the recreation room. One of them immediately noticed the empty space behind the concrete pillar. He tapped his radio, his head swiveling rapidly as he scanned the room. The second orderly pointed directly toward the observation booth. They began sprinting toward the glass door. I looked down at the computer screen. The transfer protocol was moving agonizingly slow. 70%. 80%. The heavy footsteps of the approaching guards echoed loudly. I kept my eyes locked on the glowing green progress bar, refusing to move. 85%. 90%. The first orderly reached the door and yanked the handle. He realized it was jammed and slammed his heavy fist against the reinforced glass, shouting for me to step away from the terminal. The second guard fumbled wildly for his master key card. 95%. 98%. The electronic lock beeped sharply as the guard swiped his card. The magnetic seal disengaged. 100%. Transfer complete. The notification flashed across the screen just as the heavy door burst open, slamming violently against the interior wall. I did not flinch. With a single devastatingly fast keystroke, I executed a hard wipe protocol. I completely purged the administrative laptop's local drive, utterly destroying the operating system and leaving absolutely no digital trace of the secure transmission. The screen went completely black just as the massive orderly grabbed me by my shoulders and hurled me backward onto the floor. 2 more guards rushed into the small booth, pinning my arms securely against the linoleum. They shouted frantic commands calling for chemical restraints and immediate isolation. I let my body go completely limp, offering absolutely no physical resistance. I stared up at the blank ceiling, feeling the cold floor pressing against my spine. The guards thought they had successfully neutralized a dangerous, unstable patient. They had no idea they were already too late. The undeniable proof of my identity, the forged medical records, and the entire financial blueprint of my brother's fraudulent biotech empire were currently sitting securely in the hands of a former Interpol director. The countdown to my birthday was still ticking, but the trap had officially been set. The orderlies hauled me off the observation booth floor. They dragged my limp body down the bright corridors. I kept my eyes half closed, maintaining the illusion of a broken mind. They threw me back into my isolation cell and administered another dose of sedatives. I knew their routine. I hid the pill beneath my tongue and spit it out. The second the door clicked shut, I spent the next 48 hours in total silence. The countdown to my 34th birthday ticked away. Every time a nurse checked on me, I lay perfectly still. I conserved my energy visualizing the data packet I had sent to Victor. I knew federal bureaucracy moved slowly, but Victor was a master at navigating those waters. He had the undeniable proof of my identity, the forged medical records, and the financial ledgers. He just needed enough time to mobilize the cavalry. The morning of my 34th birthday arrived without sunlight to mark the occasion. The only indication that my trust fund had officially unlocked was the harsh grinding of the deadbolts outside my door. The steel barrier swung open, revealing Arthur. He was dressed in an immaculate charcoal suit looking out of place in the sterile ward. Behind him stood Dr. Vance and a burly, orderly. Arthur clutched a sleek silver briefcase in his left hand. His face was flushed with the thrill of victory. He had spent 30 years orchestrating this moment, and he believed he had finally crossed the finish line. Arthur stepped into the cell, his shoes echoing against the concrete. "Happy birthday, Nora," he said, his voice dripping with venomous sarcasm. "You have been a terribly difficult investment to manage, but today you are finally going to pay out." He set the briefcase down on the table and snapped the locks open. Inside rested a portable retinal scanner and a digital fingerprint reader. The devices were hardwired to a satellite uplink, providing an encrypted tunnel to the wealth management bank in Zurich. $300 million sat waiting, requiring only my biological signature to release the funds directly into his offshore accounts. "Hold her steady," Arthur commanded the orderly. The massive man stepped forward and pinned my shoulders against the thin mattress. I let my head roll to the side, feigning absolute chemical paralysis. Arthur picked up the retinal scanner. It emitted a low hum as the targeting laser activated. He walked over to my bed, his face twisted into a mask of triumphant greed. "You thought you could outsmart me," Arthur whispered, leaning in close. "You are nothing but a ghost. After today, you will simply fade away." Arthur grabbed my jaw with his rough hand, his fingers digging brutally into my cheeks. He forced my head upward, positioning the scanner over my face. I kept my eyes squeezed shut. "Open your eyes, you ungrateful brat," Arthur snarled. He removed one hand from the device and pinched my right eyelid, using his thumb and forefinger to pry my eye open. The red targeting laser pierced my vision, attempting to lock onto the black starburst ring circling my golden pupil. I stared directly into the laser, waiting for the system to register the scan. Before the device could emit the confirmation chime, a deafening concussive boom echoed through the facility. The heavy steel door of my isolation cell did not just open, it was violently blown entirely off its reinforced hinges. The massive slab of metal crashed onto the floor, sending up a thick cloud of plaster dust. Before Arthur could even turn his head to look, the room was suddenly flooded with armed tactical agents wearing heavy protective gear. "Drop the device and put your hands on your head," a voice roared through the chaos. Arthur froze, the retinal scanner slipping from his trembling fingers and clattering noisily onto the concrete floor. The orderly holding my shoulders instantly threw his hands into the air, backing away in total surrender. Dr. Vance tried to bolt toward the hallway, but two armed agents intercepted him, slamming him against the wall and securing his wrists in iron cuffs. Victor stepped through the settling dust, completely ignoring the panic erupting around him. He marched directly toward Arthur. Arthur raised his hands, stammering frantically about a terrible misunderstanding and a sick daughter. Victor did not waste a single breath on conversation. He grabbed Arthur by the lapels of his charcoal suit, lifted him slightly off the ground, and slammed him brutally against the concrete wall. The impact knocked the wind completely out of Arthur, leaving him gasping for air as an agent immediately cuffed his wrists behind his back. Victor turned his attention to me. He stepped over the discarded retinal scanner and extended his hand. The chaotic noise of the raid seemed to fade into the background. I looked at his outstretched hand, then up at his steady, unwavering gaze. I did not need an orderly to lift me. I did not need a doctor to assess my condition. I pushed myself up from the plastic mattress, ignoring the lingering stiffness in my muscles. I bypassed Victor's hand and planted my bare feet firmly on the cold floor. I stood up, straightening my spine and squaring my shoulders. The scratchy hospital gown felt irrelevant. I looked down at Arthur now, kneeling on the floor, his face pale and contorted with terror. He stared at me as if seeing a monster he had accidentally created. He finally realized the girl he locked in a basement for 30 years had orchestrated his destruction. I stepped over his cowering form. Walking out of the cell, I marched down the hallway, flanked by tactical agents. I was no longer the helpless victim trapped in a nightmare. I was the heir to the Sterling Empire, and I was walking out of that asylum as a predator ready to hunt. Across the state, miles away from the shattered steel doors of the private rehabilitation facility, a completely different spectacle was unfolding. The premier technology symposium. That's when his Saturn in San Francisco was practically vibrating with manufactured excitement and aggressive corporate energy. Julian was hosting the official initial public offering launch for his biotechnology company. The massive auditorium was a monument to his stolen wealth, draped entirely in deep blue and silver silk. Hundreds of ornate modern lighting fixtures illuminated the room, casting a bright, expensive glow over a sea of elite guests. Waiters in pristine white jackets circulated smoothly through the crowd, carrying heavy silver trays loaded with artisan appetizers and vintage champagne. The room was packed to absolute capacity, with aggressive venture capitalists, prominent medical journalists, and the highest echelon of local tech society. Everyone wanted a piece of Julian's highly anticipated pharmaceutical startup. Large digital screens wrapped around the perimeter of the auditorium walls, displaying the sleek company logo, and a massive digital countdown clock ticking down to the exact moment the stock exchange would open the following morning. Julian stood directly in the center of the stage, practically glowing under the bright flashes of the press cameras. He was entirely in his element, a charismatic and highly polished fraud playing the role of a visionary genius to absolute perfection. He wore a custom-tailored velvet dinner jacket, shaking hands, firmly accepting lavish praise, and posing for photographs with influential politicians and banking executives. He projected the image of a self-made titan, completely comfortable accepting credit for scientific research he fundamentally did not understand. Standing near the edge of the front row was Evelyn. She had rushed to the symposium hours earlier to supervise the event details, completely and blissfully unaware of the tactical raid currently dismantling her husband across the state. She wore an opulent floor-length silver gown dripping with diamonds, playing the role of the proud elite society mother flawlessly. She smiled brightly for the society photographers, clinging arm in arm with wealthy venture capitalists, regaling them with entirely fabricated stories of Julian's childhood brilliance. However, beneath her polished maternal facade, Evelyn was vibrating with greedy anticipation. Her eyes continually darted toward her phone, checking for a message from Arthur. She fully expected a notification at any given moment, confirming that my forced retinal scan was complete. She believed that the $300 million sterling trust fund had successfully transferred to their hidden offshore accounts. She tasted absolute permanent victory, completely blind to the reality that her husband was currently sitting in the back of a federal transport vehicle, with his wrists secured in heavy iron cuffs. Standing rigidly beside Evelyn was Maya. Unlike the fawning investors and the sycophantic high society guests, the beautiful fiancée was not smiling. The sharp, brilliant woman had been quietly observing the glaring inconsistencies in her new family ever since my brutal, confusing expulsion in the driveway on the night of the engagement party. She wore a stunning emerald green evening gown that commanded attention, but her posture was stiff and defensive. She held a glass of sparkling water, her dark, highly observant eyes analyzing every single interaction around her. Maya was a woman built on a foundation of truth and uncompromising integrity, and her formidable intuition was currently screaming that something was fundamentally wrong with the people she was about to marry into. She noticed the slick, evasive way Julian deflected basic scientific questions from industry reporters. Whenever a medical journalist pressed him for specific details regarding the core biochemical architecture of his revolutionary medicine, Julian smoothly redirected the conversation to empty marketing buzzwords and vague promises of future innovation. He sounded like a salesman, not a scientist. Maya also noticed Evelyn's nervous, predatory energy. She listened as a society reporter bravely asked Evelyn about her other daughter, specifically referencing the dramatic wine-soaked incident at the engagement party. Evelyn did not miss a beat. She placed a manicured hand over her heart and delivered a highly practiced, sorrowful lie about my tragic, rapid mental decline. Evelyn boldly claimed to the reporter that I was currently resting safely in a specialized luxury care facility, receiving the absolute best psychiatric treatment that their generous family money could buy. Maya heard the smooth deception in Evelyn's voice, and her deep suspicion rapidly hardened into cold, analytical certainty. Furthermore, Maya's father Victor was noticeably absent from the most important night of her partner's career. She had checked her phone repeatedly over the past 2 hours. Victor had sent her one single, highly secure text message earlier in the afternoon, stating he was handling a critical, time-sensitive security matter and to trust him implicitly. Victor was a man who never missed family milestones unless lives were actively on the line. His absence at the symposium was a blaring siren, indicating that a massive operation was currently underway. The ambient music in the auditorium slowly faded as the lighting dimmed, signaling the beginning of the keynote presentation. A single bright spotlight illuminated the center stage. The crowd fell into a hushed, anticipatory silence. Julian handed his champagne glass to a passing waiter and confidently stepped to the podium. He adjusted the microphone, flashing his signature $1 million smile to the rapt audience. "Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us." On the eve of a new medical era, Julian announced, his voice echoing powerfully through the massive sound system. "Tonight we celebrate more than just a company. We celebrate the absolute triumph of innovation, transparency, and the relentless pursuit of the future." The irony of his words was thick and suffocating. The investors erupted into thunderous applause, completely enamored by the golden child and his illusion of greatness. Evelyn beamed from the front row, clapping her diamond-adorned hands together. She mentally spent the millions she falsely believed secure. The thunderous applause echoing through the grand auditorium was abruptly shattered by a deafening crash. The massive, heavy double doors at the rear of the hall were violently thrust open, slamming against the paneled walls with a force that rattled the nearest lighting fixtures. The sharp, explosive sound sliced through the polite corporate cheering like a physical blade. Hundreds of wealthy investors, journalists, and high society elites gasped in unison, their heads whipping around to face the entrance. Julian froze at the podium, his charismatic smile instantly freezing into a mask of pure confusion. His hands gripped the edges of the wooden stand as his prepared speech died completely in his throat. Evelyn abruptly stopped clapping. Her hands remained suspended in the air as the color rapidly drained from her perfectly contoured face. The triumphant, greedy glow in her eyes was extinguished in a fraction of a second, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. The symposium plunged into a stunned, breathless silence, leaving only the soft hum of the massive digital screens overhead. I stepped over the threshold and walked directly into the center of the grand auditorium. I was no longer wearing the scratchy, ill-fitting catering uniform or the terrible hospital gown that marked my servitude. I wore a razor-sharp tailored charcoal power suit that radiated absolute authority. The crisp lines of the fabric framed my posture, which was now perfectly straight and unyielding. My dark hair was pulled back into a severe, elegant style, exposing my face entirely to the glare of the flashbulbs. I walked with the measured, predatory stride of a woman who legally owned every single square inch of the empire built around her. I did not bow my head. I did not avert my gaze. I looked directly toward the main stage, my golden amber eyes blazing under the auditorium lights, the distinct, jagged starburst rings of black visible to anyone who dared to look closely. I was Nora Sterling, the sole surviving heir to a stolen dynasty, and I had come to collect my debts. I did not walk into that room alone. Flanking me on my right was Victor, his heavy wool overcoat replaced by a sharp tactical jacket. He moved with the undeniable, commanding presence of a seasoned investigator closing his greatest case. Surrounding us was a tightly formed phalanx of heavily armed tactical agents wearing dark vests adorned with bold letters. The visual impact of a tactical raid storming an elite corporate event sent a shock wave of panic rippling through the wealthy crowd. Venture capitalists backed away, frantically clutching their champagne glasses, terrified of being caught in the crossfire of an international investigation. High-profile journalists instinctively raised their cameras, their professional instincts overriding their shock as they began furiously documenting the unprecedented disruption. The collective gasp of the high society guests filled the cavernous room, completely drowning out the ambient hum of the venue. On the main stage, Julian finally managed to close his gaping mouth. His eyes darted wildly from the tactical agents to my face, completely unable to process the transformation. He expected a lobotomized patient rotting in an isolated cell. He did not expect the sister he had discarded to march into his kingdom, backed by the full weight of the authorities. Evelyn physically stumbled backward, her designer heels catching on the carpet. She clutched her diamond necklace, her mouth opening and closing as she desperately searched the entrance for Arthur, still completely unaware that her husband was already locked inside a transport vehicle. Maya stood rigidly beside them, her sharp eyes scanning the tactical team before locking onto her father. Victor caught her gaze across the room and gave a single firm nod. Maya visibly exhaled, her posture instantly shifting from defensive suspicion to absolute vindicated clarity. A team of heavily built private security guards in dark suits rushed forward to intercept our group, aggressively demanding that we halt and present invitations. I did not stop walking, and I did not engage in a verbal argument with hired muscle. I reached into the interior pocket of my tailored jacket and withdrew my smartphone. My fingers, steady and precise, flew across the illuminated screen. While Julian was busy shaking hands and posing for magazines over the past week, I had been quietly embedded within the deepest architectural layers of his company servers. I had programmed a highly specific, totally invisible master override protocol designed exclusively for this exact moment. It was a digital kill switch resting dormant within the framework of his network, completely immune to any external firewalls or administrative blocks his expensive technology team had attempted to build. I tapped the final execution command on my screen and hit send. The deployment was instantaneous. Every single massive digital screen wrapped around the perimeter of the grand auditorium glitched simultaneously. The sleek, carefully designed corporate logos flickered wildly. The giant digital countdown clock, which had been ticking down to the opening of the stock exchange, froze completely in place. A sharp burst of static feedback shrieked through the venue audio system, causing several prominent investors to cover their ears in pain. Then the screens went entirely pitch black. The opulent room was suddenly bathed in shadows, leaving Julian standing on the stage in total humiliating darkness. His microphone cut out, rendering him voiceless. I lowered my phone and stared directly at my brother, holding the undisputed power to dismantle his fake reality. The digital hijacking was flawless. stripping away his entire corporate facade in a matter of seconds. He was no longer in charge of the narrative. I had seized absolute control of the room, and I was about to project the devastating, undeniable truth for the entire world to see. A second later, the pitch-black perimeter screens flashed back to life with a blinding clinical white glare. Julian's sleek corporate branding was entirely gone, replaced by a visual execution that tore their carefully curated lies to shreds. The massive central display projected a high-resolution scan of a 30-year-old international missing child poster. The bold, weathered header, reading "Missing Heir Nora Sterling," filled the cavernous auditorium, casting a stark light over the stunned audience. Directly beneath the header, the childhood photograph of a quiet 4-year-old girl was positioned side by side with a magnified high-definition close-up of my own face. The visual match was undeniable. The screens clearly highlighted my unique mutation, showing the identical, highly distinct black starburst rings circling my golden amber pupils. The crowd gasped as the historical puzzle pieces slammed together in real time. Before Julian could recover his footing, the perimeter screen split into a multi-window display, flashing the official encrypted laboratory document we had secured hours earlier. The certified genetic report from the private genomics lab blasted across the hall, showcasing the definitive 99.9% DNA parentage match with Richard and Eleanor Sterling. The green text vibrated with a profound, unyielding finality. I watched the elite venture capitalists lean forward, their professional skepticism instantly melting into absolute shock. High-profile medical journalists began snapping photos of the screens, their cameras clicking frantically as they realized the top-tier startup of the year was dissolving in front of their eyes. Then came the definitive financial destruction. The screens began scrolling through thousands of pages of offshore banking ledgers, corporate wire transfers, and fraudulent clinical trial data I had systematically extracted from Julian's private servers. Every single transaction was laid bare for the public to witness. The digital breadcrumbs formed an ironclad web, quate, crating 2A, quate into generational. Quate crumbs formed an ironclad web tracing in the Cayman Islands and straight into Julian's corporate treasury. The screens illuminated the exact routing numbers, the forged signatures, and the fabricated venture capital registries Julian had used to trick the industry. It was the absolute, irrefutable proof that his entire billion-dollar biotechnology empire was built entirely on embezzled, blood-soaked money stolen from a kidnapped child. Absolute panic erupted on the main stage. Arthur, who had just been marched into the rear of the auditorium by armed tactical agents, completely lost his upper-class composure. His charcoal suit was rumpled, his hair disheveled, and his face twisted into a mask of pure terror. He and Evelyn began screaming at the top of their lungs, desperation cracking their voices as they launched a frantic, chaotic attempt to gaslight the entire room. They pointed trembling, manicured fingers directly at me, projecting their final pathetic defense. "She is insane," Evelyn shrieked, her voice reaching a hysterical, unhinged pitch that echoed off the high ceilings. "Do not look at those screens. This is a total fabrication. Our daughter is a dangerous, mentally unstable dropout who is having a severe psychotic break. She has been diagnosed with severe paranoid schizophrenia. She stole those files and twisted them because she is desperately jealous of her brother's success. Security turned those monitors off immediately. She is dangerous." Arthur thrashed against the iron cuffs binding his wrists, shouting over the roaring murmurs of the crowd. "This is corporate espionage," Arthur roared, his authoritative businessman voice cracking with desperation. "This girl is a criminal. She is unstable and needs to be institutionalized. The images are fake. My son Julian is a visionary. This is an illegal ambush designed to tank our public offering." They stood on the stage violently, throwing their twisted lies against a wall of absolute solid evidence, desperately counting on their frantic performance to override the truth. But their words carried absolutely no weight in the heavy silence of the auditorium. The gaslighting was too loud, too desperate, and entirely transparent. I stood perfectly still in my tailored charcoal suit, my hands folded calmly in front of me, watching them self-destruct with a cold, detached satisfaction. The contrast between my steady predator-like calm and their unhinged, frantic screaming told the entire story to the audience. The elite crowd of investors and society elites did not look away from the scrolling ledgers. The financial data was too precise, the routing numbers too detailed to be dismissed as the delusions of a patient. A heavy wave of collective shock washed over the room, replaced instantly by rapid, chaotic murmurs. Industry tycoons pulled out their phones, frantically calling their brokers to halt their buy orders before the market opened. The medical journalists began whispering loudly among themselves, typing breaking news alerts directly onto their tablets. The perfectly curated facade of family perfection had crumbled into an international crime scene, and the entire room was watching the execution in real time. Julian took a step back from the podium, his face an ashen mask of pure ruin. He looked at the scrolling wire transfers, displaying his private account numbers, then looked down at his golden child hands, realizing his stolen kingdom was vanishing into thin air. He turned his desperate gaze toward Maya, his mouth opening to offer a smooth, calculated sales pitch to salvage his relationship. But Maya was already moving with definitive finality. She stepped away from him completely, her posture rigid with an intense, burning disgust that commanded the space between them. The layers of massive deception had been thoroughly stripped away, leaving her partner entirely exposed as a pathetic, parasitic fraud. She walked across the stage, turning her back on his frantic pleading without a single shred of hesitation. The final layer of false family alignment had broken completely. The high-profile guests watched the dynamic shift their collective attention, pinning Julian down under a mountain of public shame. The exposure was absolute, clear, and devastatingly permanent for everyone involved in their elaborate, toxic game of greed. I stood perfectly tall, completely ready to watch the final pieces of their stolen empire burn to the ground. Maya stood completely motionless in the center of the stage, the harsh glow of the digital screens illuminating the sharp angles of her face. For a fleeting moment, she simply stared at the cascading financial documents broadcasting across the room. Her brilliant mind rapidly processed the overwhelming data connecting the phantom investments, the offshore accounts, and the staggering reality that the man she was about to marry was nothing more than a hollow, parasitic fraud. She did not panic or dissolve into tears. Instead, a terrifying absolute calm washed over her entirely. She slowly turned her gaze away from the damning ledgers and looked directly across the chaotic auditorium. She bypassed the frantic investors and the shouting journalists, finding her father standing solidly beside me. Victor met his daughter's eyes. He did not say a single word. He simply gave one slow, definitive nod. That solitary gesture confirmed everything. Her father, a man whose integrity was legendary, had validated the massive, horrifying truth. The foundation of her entire engagement was built on a 30-year kidnapping and a stolen inheritance. Julian, desperate to cling to the last remaining pillar of his crumbling existence, frantically reached out to grab Maya's hands. He forced a pathetic, trembling smile onto his face, attempting to deploy the same manipulative charm he had used to deceive her from the very beginning. "Maya, please, you have to listen to me," Julian begged, his voice cracking loudly over the ambient noise of the auditorium. "This is a massive misunderstanding. That girl is sick. She is a dangerous hacker who doctored these files to ruin us. You know me. We are building a future together. Do not let her crazy delusions destroy what we have." Maya looked down at his hands, grasping hers. The disgust in her eyes was so potent, it almost had a physical weight. She smoothly and forcefully ripped her hands away from his grasp, stepping back as if his touch was utterly toxic. The sheer revulsion radiating from her posture made Julian shrink backward. The auditorium, which had been buzzing with frantic whispers, suddenly fell deadly silent. The elite crowd, the journalists, and the investors collectively held their breath, completely captivated by the raw, unscripted destruction of a high society engagement taking place on the main stage. "You do not get to speak to me," Maya stated. Her voice was not a scream. It was dangerously low, precise, and amplified perfectly by the acoustics of the massive hall, slicing through the air like a razor. "Every single word you have ever told me about your genius, your hard work, and your brilliant startup was a fabricated lie. You are not a visionary. You are a thief, playing dress-up in a custom suit, funded by a stolen child. Julian stammered, his face flushing a deep, humiliating crimson. Maya, I built this company. I am the chief executive. I can explain the funding. I swear to you, I did not know the money was stolen from her. Do not insult my intelligence. Maya cut him off, her tone absolutely freezing. You knew exactly who was scrubbing your floors while you paraded around claiming to be a self-made titan. You happily watched your parents abuse a captive servant, and you eagerly spent the millions they laundered to buy your fake reputation. You are not just a fraud, Julian. You are a parasite. You have spent your entire pathetic life feeding off the brilliance and the blood of a woman you kept locked in a basement. Evelyn, still struggling against the tactical agents near the back of the room, shrieked in protest. Do not speak to my son that way. We are a prominent family. We are the elite. Maya did not even dignify Evelyn with a glance. She kept her piercing gaze locked entirely on Julian, who was now visibly shaking under the intense public scrutiny. My family built our legacy on actual intelligence, relentless hard work, and absolute integrity. Maya proclaimed, her voice echoing with profound authority. We do not align ourselves with criminals. We do not marry cowards who steal from kidnapping victims, and we certainly do not sit at the table with parasites who lack the basic human decency to write their own scientific research. Julian opened his mouth to offer another pathetic defense, but Maya raised a single commanding hand, instantly shutting him down completely. She reached for her left hand and gripped the massive, flawless antique diamond engagement ring Julian had placed on her finger just months ago. The stone caught the bright light of the fixtures, sparkling brilliantly against her dark skin. With a swift, fluid motion, she slid the ring completely off her finger. Julian watched her in absolute horror. He had left his half-full crystal glass of vintage champagne resting on the wooden podium when the screens first went black. Maya picked up the glass. She held her bare left hand over the rim and unceremoniously dropped the multi-million-dollar diamond directly into the bubbling alcohol. It sank to the bottom with a heavy, dismissive clink. "Keep your stolen jewelry," Maya said, her voice dripping with absolute finality. "Use it to pay your criminal defense attorneys. You are going to need every single cent." Without a single backward glance, Maya turned her back on her ruined fiancé. She walked down the short steps of the main stage, her emerald evening gown sweeping elegantly across the floor. The large crowd of wealthy investors and stunned journalists instinctively parted for her, creating a wide, clear path through the center of the grand auditorium. She walked with the undeniable grace of a woman who had just excised a massive tumor from her life. She crossed the expansive floor and walked directly toward our group. She stopped right beside her father, standing shoulder to shoulder with Victor and me. She looked at me, her expression softening into profound respect and unwavering solidarity. The three of us stood together as an impenetrable, formidable wall, completely united against the fraudulent family that had tried to destroy us. The visual was absolute perfection. The brilliant neuroscientist, the veteran Interpol director, and the true sterling heir, standing victorious over the ashes of Julian's shattered empire. The room remained perfectly still, processing the magnitude of the execution they had just witnessed. Julian stood entirely alone on the elevated stage, a ruined man staring blankly at the sunken diamond in his glass, knowing his entire existence had just been publicly eradicated. The stillness in the grand auditorium was abruptly shattered by the sharp, authoritative voice of the lead tactical agent. The team mobilized with flawless precision, swarming the back of the room where Arthur and Evelyn were still desperately attempting to argue their way out of the undeniable truth. Two heavily armored agents grabbed Arthur by the arms, forcefully spinning him around. The loud metallic click of heavy iron handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists echoed sharply over the stunned murmurs of the crowd. Arthur, the man who had spent 3 decades projecting an image of untouchable corporate perfection, was completely stripped of his dignity. He thrashed weakly against the agent's grip, sputtering incoherent threats about calling his lawyers, but his protests were entirely useless. Evelyn fared even worse. As an agent reached for her, she let out a piercing, unhinged shriek, aggressively swatting at the tactical gear. "Do not touch me," she screamed, her voice cracking under the intense strain of total exposure. "I am a respected member of this community. I demand you release my husband instantly." The lead agent did not even flinch. He swiftly secured her arms behind her back, locking the heavy cuffs over her diamond jewelry. The facade of the elite society matriarch dissolved completely, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, cornered criminal. The high-profile journalists and society photographers stationed around the auditorium immediately sprang into action. Hundreds of camera flashes erupted simultaneously, bathing the struggling couple in a blinding strobe light execution. They were documenting the spectacular, humiliating downfall of the fake dynasty for the front pages of tomorrow's papers. Evelyn frantically tried to hide her face behind her shoulder, weeping bitterly as the glaring lights captured her ruin. Arthur simply stared at the floor, his entire life reduced to a criminal spectacle. On the main stage, the nightmare for Julian was rapidly escalating into total financial obliteration. The wealthy venture capitalists gathered in the room had seen absolutely enough. Their phones were ringing and vibrating relentlessly as their risk management teams back at headquarters scrambled to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout. With furious, frantic gestures, the investors began tapping their screens, executing emergency withdrawal protocols, and legally nullifying their initial public offering commitments. I watched the massive digital screens overhead. My customized override program was still actively pulling live data from Julian's corporate servers, the glowing numbers representing his company's estimated market valuation began to plummet in real time. The billions of dollars in projected capital rapidly bled away, tumbling down into the millions, then the thousands before flatlining entirely. The digital graphs dropped straight to absolute zero. In less than 3 minutes, the highly anticipated biotech startup was completely liquidated. His entire empire, built exclusively on my stolen inheritance and maintained by my silent labor, was transformed into worthless digital dust. Julian stood paralyzed at the podium, watching the screens confirm his total destruction. The realization hit him with the devastating force of a physical blow. He had absolutely nothing left. His brilliant fiancée had publicly abandoned him. His criminal parents were currently being marched out of the auditorium in handcuffs. His company was dead and his reputation was permanently incinerated. The arrogant golden child persona melted away, leaving a desperate hollow shell of a man who suddenly realized he was entirely powerless. He stumbled down the short steps of the main stage, his custom-tailored suit looking ridiculous on his defeated frame. The crowd of angry investors parted, treating him like a highly contagious disease. Julian walked slowly across the floor, moving directly toward the spot where Victor, Maya, and I stood. His eyes were wide with blind panic, searching my face for any shred of the subservient, obedient maid he had tormented for 27 years. When he reached me, his legs simply gave out. Julian, the untouchable biotech titan, collapsed heavily onto his knees. The sharp thud of his kneecaps hitting the floor resonated perfectly in the quieted room. He looked up at me, his face slick with sweat and tears of profound desperation. He reached out with trembling hands, desperately trying to grab the hem of my tailored jacket. Victor took a subtle half-step forward, a silent, lethal warning that made Julian instantly withdraw his hands. "Nora, please," Julian sobbed, his voice stripped of all its former arrogant bravado. "Please, you cannot do this to me. I had no idea they stole the money from you. I swear I did not know about the kidnapping. You have to believe me. We grew up together. We shared a home. I am your brother. You have the power to stop this, Nora. Just tell them to let me keep the company. I will give you whatever equity you want. Please have mercy on me." I looked down at the pathetic weeping man kneeling at my feet. For 27 years, he had watched me scrub the dirt from his shoes. He had gladly accepted the gourmet meals I cooked, the pristine laundry I folded, and the complex computer code I secretly wrote to keep his fraudulent business afloat. He had laughed when his mother called me a worthless dropout. He had smirked when she threw $50 in my face and banished me to the freezing streets. He had never once viewed me as a human being, let alone a sister, until the exact second I held the power to destroy him. I did not feel a single ounce of anger, pity, or vindication. I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, surgical detachment. I looked down at him with the chilling, unyielding authority of a woman who had fully reclaimed her stolen throne. "You are not my brother," I stated, my voice perfectly level, ringing clearly across the breathless auditorium. "You are simply the parasite that fed on my stolen life. You watched them lock me in a basement, and you happily spent the millions they laundered in your name. You enjoyed every second of my misery, because it elevated your fake superiority." Julian let out a miserable, broken wail, pressing his hands together in a frantic gesture of prayer. "Please, Nora, I am begging you." I tilted my head slightly, observing his complete degradation with total satisfaction. I stepped back, severing our proximity with absolute finality. A master does not beg a servant for mercy. I delivered the cold, calculated rejection, and a true heir does not negotiate with thieves. I turned my back on him, completely facing the exit. Two tactical agents immediately stepped forward, pulling the sobbing, ruined golden child up from the floor and securing his wrists in cold iron. The satisfying click of the handcuffs sealing Julian's fate echoed behind me, serving as the perfect closing note to a 30-year-old nightmare. I walked out of the symposium center, the flashing lights of the media trucks fading into the dark night behind us. Victor, Maya, and I stepped into the back seat of a waiting black sedan, the heavy doors closing, with a solid click that silenced the chaotic shouting of the reporters outside. The immediate aftermath of the event was a rapid and relentless cascade of total systemic collapse for the people who had stolen my life. Within 48 hours, the international justice system began its unyielding grind, moving with a fast-paced momentum that left the fraudulent family completely paralyzed. Arthur and Evelyn were transported directly to a maximum security holding facility. They were stripped of their expensive designer evening wear, their jewelry confiscated as evidence, and forced into matching drab jumpsuits. The public arraignment was a brutal, shocking wake-up call for high society. The judge, reading through the massive data dump I had pushed into the network, looked down at the cowering couple with an expression of absolute disgust. Due to the extreme flight risk posed by their secret offshore accounts and the horrific calculated nature of a 30-year kidnapping case, bail was completely and permanently denied. They were remanded into custody, locked inside isolated holding cells, while a team of prosecutors stacked an ironclad list of indictments against them. They were charged with international kidnapping, grand larceny, identity theft, and multi-million-dollar wire fraud. They were officially facing life in a federal penitentiary, without the rarest possibility of parole. The domino effect tore through Julian's existence with a terrifying, merciless speed. The regulatory commissions launched a massive emergency investigation into his defunct biotechnology firm the very next morning. Armed forensic auditors stormed his glass corporate headquarters, seizing hard drives, company servers, and every secure financial registry. The public listing was permanently canceled, and the company was plunged into immediate forced liquidation. Julian's personal assets were frozen within days, as the full scale of the money laundering operation was globally exposed. I watched from a distance as the markers of his stolen success were systematically stripped away by court order. Foreclosure notices were aggressively slapped onto the glass front doors of his luxury penthouse. His entire fleet of high-end foreign sports cars was towed away from the building's circular driveway in broad daylight, witnessed by the very high society peers he had desperately tried to impress. The exclusive country club canceled his membership, and his false executive status vanished overnight. Left completely destitute and unable to afford his private legal team, Julian was assigned a public defender as the authorities hit him with severe criminal accessory charges. He was legally trapped, facing a decade in prison for knowingly operating an enterprise funded entirely by grand larceny. While they rotted inside their respective cells, my focus shifted entirely to the grand definitive reclamation of my stolen identity. The elite legal team assembled by Victor worked around the clock to execute the master plan. We sat in a high-rise office building overlooking the sprawling city skyline, surrounded by stacks of certified genealogical records, original police explosive reports, and the ironclad DNA profiles, the process was cold, direct, and profoundly empowering. I picked up the heavy fountain pen, my hand completely steady. After years of forced compliance with a single fluid motion, I signed the master petition to officially and legally reclaim my true name. The forced identity Arthur and Evelyn had branded me with for 27 years was systematically eradicated from every municipal, state, and international registry. The birth certificate they had falsified to hide their crime was legally nullified by a judge, replaced by an authentic document restoring my true lineage as Nora Sterling. I watched the court clerk press the official seal onto the paperwork, a satisfying sound that completely erased my abusers from my legal history. They no longer held any legal connection to my existence. They were officially rewritten as nothing more than common captors in the eyes of the law. The final massive payoff occurred when the legal team initialized the verification protocol for the Sterling Family Generational Trust. The wealth management bank in Zurich, presented with the court orders and the certified DNA parentage match, immediately unlocked the primary vault that had been frozen for 3 long decades. The impenetrable time-locked barriers collapsed. I stood beside Victor and Maya as the bank's terminal initialized a live secured biometric scan. I pressed my thumb firmly onto the encrypted glass panel and looked directly into the optical scanner, letting the camera read the black starburst rings circling my golden pupils. The system beeped sharply, confirming the signature of the true heir. $300 million instantly transferred into a pristine wealth account under my absolute unrestricted control. The immense fortune my biological parents had established to protect my future was finally in my hands. Arthur and Evelyn had kept me locked in a basement, treating me like a disposable broken servant, completely blind to the reality that my blood was the only key to the vault. I closed the legal portfolio, a quiet, powerful sense of absolute peace settling over my mind. The legal warfare was over. The execution was flawless, and the real Nora Sterling had officially returned to claim her kingdom. 6 months after the gavel fell on my former captors, the kingdom I built looked entirely different than the sterile, greed-driven corporate offices Arthur and Julian had worshipped. I sat at the head of a massive live-edge walnut table in the sunlit boardroom of the newly established Sterling Tech Foundation. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping, unobstructed view of the city skyline, a stark and beautiful contrast to the windowless concrete basement where I had spent the first 27 years of my life. I was no longer hiding behind a mop or a cheap hospital gown. I wore a tailored navy blazer, reviewing a thick portfolio of grant applications with the sharp, unclouded focus of a woman completely in control of her destiny. My foundation was not a vanity project designed to buy high society favor. It was a highly tactical, aggressively funded initiative aimed directly at providing elite cybersecurity education and advanced coding boot camps to vulnerable at-risk youth. I knew exactly what it meant to be trapped, isolated, and stripped of all physical power. I also knew that handing a brilliant cornered mind the digital keys to the world was the ultimate equalizer. We were building state-of-the-art computer labs in forgotten neighborhoods, teaching kids how to build impenetrable networks and write code that could break through any ceiling. We were actively forging the next generation of digital architects, ensuring they would never be held captive by anyone. Sitting directly across from me at the boardroom table was Maya. She had completely shed the toxic weight of her brief fraudulent engagement to Julian, emerging even sharper and more formidable than before. She now served as the chief legal counsel for the Sterling Foundation, bringing her fierce intellect and uncompromising integrity to every contract and initiative we launched. She wore a striking ivory suit, her dark eyes scanning a complex legal document with lethal precision. She flipped the page, signed her name with a swift stroke of her pen, and slid the finalized contract across the polished wood toward me. That secures the funding for the 3 new tech centers in the coastal district. Maya announced, her voice radiating absolute confidence. The municipal board tried to tie us up in zoning bureaucracy, but I reminded them of the sheer magnitude of our endowment. They folded in less than 10 minutes. I smiled, signing the bottom of the document to authorize the multi-million-dollar transfer. "You are terrifying when you negotiate, Maya," I said, handing the portfolio to our executive assistant. She leaned back in her chair, a genuine warm smile breaking across her face. "I learned from watching the best Nora. We do not negotiate with parasites, and we certainly do not let bureaucrats slow down our progress." The mutual respect between us was profound. We were bound not by the superficial ties of a fake engagement, but by a shared survival, a mutual victory, and a deep, authentic sisterhood that Arthur and Evelyn could never have comprehended. As the afternoon sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting a warm, golden hue across the city, we wrapped up the final board meeting of the quarter. Maya and I took the private elevator down to the secure parking garage, where a sleek, armored vehicle was waiting. We were not heading to a cramped apartment or a cheap roadside motel. We were driving directly to the coast, to the exact acreage where I had purchased a massive plot of land overlooking the ocean. I had used a fraction of my recovered trust fund to build a sprawling modern sanctuary on the pristine coastal cliffs. The drive was peaceful, accompanied only by the soft hum of the engine and the comfortable silence between two women who no longer had to constantly look over their shoulders. When the heavy iron gates of the estate parted, the car glided up the winding driveway flanked by ancient oak trees and manicured gardens that smelled faintly of jasmine and sea salt. The architecture of the new house was breathtaking, featuring massive expanses of reinforced glass and natural stone that embraced the natural beauty of the ocean, rather than trying to dominate it. I stepped out of the vehicle and walked through the grand foyer, feeling the solid, grounding energy of a home that truly belonged to me. I moved straight toward the back of the house, pushing open the heavy glass doors that led out onto the expansive multi-level stone balcony overlooking the churning water. The cold, salty wind whipped through my hair, carrying the rhythmic, powerful roar of the waves, crashing against the jagged rocks below. It was a wild, untamed sound that made me feel incredibly alive. A moment later, I heard the heavy, familiar footsteps of Victor stepping onto the stone patio. He walked over and stood solidly beside me, resting his hands on the thick glass railing. He had officially retired from his international consulting firm, accepting a permanent position as the head of security and estate management for the Sterling properties. But his role was far more profound than a title. He was the seasoned investigator who had looked past the cheap uniform and the fabricated madness to see the truth in my eyes. He was the fiercely protective father figure I had been denied my entire life. Maya joined us on the balcony a few seconds later, handing me a steaming mug of black coffee. The three of us stood shoulder to shoulder, looking out at the endless horizon where the dark water met the fading twilight sky. There were no cameras flashing, no elite society guests to impress, and absolutely no lies left to maintain. The silence we shared was not born of fear or forced submission. It was the rich, heavy silence of absolute freedom. I took a slow sip of the coffee, letting the warmth spread through my chest as I reflected on the unbelievable trajectory of my existence. For 27 years, I was conditioned to believe that blood dictated worth and that my complete isolation was a natural, inescapable punishment. I was taught that family was a fortress built on secrets, emotional coldness, and strict obedience. But standing here flanked by a brilliant legal mind who chose to fight for me, and a retired director who risked his life to expose the truth, I finally understood the greatest lesson of all. The family you are born into might shape the beginning of your story, but the family you actively choose has the power to completely rewrite the ending. Blood had made me a billionaire, but loyalty, courage, and the frightened, subservient ghost who scrubbed floors in the dark and cowered at the sound of heavy footsteps was completely eradicated. I closed my eyes, listening to the crashing waves, completely at peace with the empire I now commanded. I was no longer the broken maid trapped in the basement. I was Nora Sterling, the undeniable master of my own magnificent world. The most profound takeaway from this narrative is the realization that genuine power cannot be permanently suppressed by external circumstances, provided you continuously cultivate your inner resilience and skills. For decades, the protagonist was subjected to severe psychological abuse, physical isolation, and a deliberately manufactured false reality. Her captors stripped away her wealth, her true name, and her basic human dignity, operating under the arrogant assumption that controlling her environment meant controlling her potential. Instead of succumbing to the manufactured despair of her windowless basement, she weaponized her isolation. She used the very tools handed to her for servitude to quietly build an unparalleled mastery of cybersecurity and network architecture. This highlights a universal truth about adversity. When oppressive forces attempt to bury you, they inadvertently provide the darkness necessary for profound, silent growth. The oppressor's greatest vulnerability is always their underestimation of the oppressed. This narrative demonstrates that our ultimate value is not dictated by the labels others force upon us. Whether they call us broken, unstable, or worthless, true identity is forged through the quiet, relentless acquisition of knowledge and the refusal to surrender our intellectual autonomy. The protagonist did not wait for a savior to hand her a weapon. She forged her own digital armory right under the noses of her abusers. Her eventual victory was not a stroke of sudden luck, but the inevitable culmination of years spent turning her prison into a training ground. In our own lives, we all face challenging environments or manipulative individuals that actively seek to diminish our inherent worth and unfairly limit our true potential. It is our responsibility to reject those false narratives and secretly build the capabilities that will eventually set us free. Transform your current obstacles into the exact foundation for your absolute independence starting right now.